An orc was cornered by a black wolf in the most isolated part of the forest. No way out, just her, the animal, and the heavy silence of someone who knows they are about to lose. A farmer who lived right nearby saw everything from his yard. He could have stayed still. He could have gone inside and pretended he didn't see. It was safer. It made more sense. But something in him wouldn't let him. What he did in the next few seconds didn't just save one life. It changed both of them. Forever. There are three kinds of brave. The brave of someone who knows they will win. The brave of someone too foolish to know they will lose. And the brave of someone who sees the danger clearly and moves anyway. The forest of Ashenvale was not the kind of place that made you want to stop and rest. The trees grew crooked, like old fingers pointing at a sky you could almost never see through the branches. Moss covered everything. Rocks, roots, the forgotten bones of animals that had made the mistake of stopping too long. It was a forest that taught one lesson over and over in every broken branch and every path that led to nowhere. Keep moving, or the forest decides for you. Zara had learned that lesson earlier than most. She was 26 winters old, and she carried every single one of them in her muscles and in the thin scars that crossed her forearms, like a kind of writing only she could read. Her skin was a bright, living green that caught whatever light found its way between the trees and gave it back as something close to copper, close to gold, the color of something alive that refused to go dark. Her long black hair fell straight to her waist, slightly tangled, tucked loosely behind her left pointed ear with a strip of leather that had once been part of a piece of armor. Her amber eyes, warm gold with little flecks of deeper yellow, swept across the forest floor with the careful attention of someone who had been taught since childhood that the world does not warn you before it hits. She had left her clan's camp before sunrise, when the fog still sat heavy on the rocks and the smell of wet dirt was thick enough to almost taste. She had no real destination. She only had the weight of being near her people and the need to not be. Her clan had camped 2 miles away, or had camped there, or had moved during the night without telling her. It was hard to know. Since the day she had spoken up against the killing of 3 unarmed human merchants who had wandered into clan territory without knowing it, the silence around her had changed. It was no longer the silence of respect. It was the silence of people deciding something. She knew that silence. It was the same one that had come before her mother's exile years ago. So she walked, because walking was the one thing that still belonged entirely to her. That was when she heard it, not a branch breaking, not the rustle of leaves. It was the absence of sound. The birds that had been singing all stopped at the same exact moment, like someone had closed a hand around the air. Zara stopped. Her amber eyes swept the space between the trees to her left, then her right, then... The wolf was 8 meters away. Black as the inside of a cave without a torch, with its fur raised along its spine like a war crest. Too big for an ordinary wolf. Something was wrong with the size of its shoulders, with the way its front paws were planted on the ground, toes spread wide, its weight shifted forward and ready. Its eyes were amber too, but where Zara's eyes held warmth, the wolf's held only the cold math of hunger. Zara did not run. Running would be the end. She stepped back slowly, testing each step before shifting her weight, her eyes locked on the animal. Her right hand went to the knife at her hip. Too small a knife for this, she knew, but it was what she had. The wolf matched every inch of her slow retreat, with its head low and its shoulders rising, its body pressing down into the shape that comes right before. The root came out of nowhere under her heel. She fell backward with a force that knocked the air from her lungs, her left elbow hitting the moss-covered rocks first. With a crack, she felt more than heard. The pain came a second later, hot and sharp, and with it came the deep throb of a twisted ankle pressing hard against her leather boot. She tried to stand. Her foot would not hold her. The wolf moved forward, and then there was a human shout, not a shout of fear, but the rough, wordless kind that comes out of someone who acts before they think. And something cut through the air and hit the animal's side with a flat, hard sound. The wolf yelped and spun toward the new threat, and Zara from the ground saw the farmer for the first time. He was about 30 meters away, standing in the middle of his yard, with a hoe raised like a spear. Tall, with wide shoulders, a simple linen shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, showing the arms of a man who carried rocks and turned earth every single day. His dark brown hair was messy from the wind, and from his dark brown eyes came an expression that Zara would spend days trying to understand. It was not heroism, it was not madness, it was simply a refusal, deep, immediate and total, to stand still and watch. The wolf turned toward him. The farmer did not step back. He raised the hoe again and moved one step forward. Just one step, but deliberate, his whole body saying, "This ground is mine." And the wolf, wounded and suddenly unsure of the situation, did what smart animals do when the numbers change. It reconsidered, not without cost. Before retreating into the trees, it launched itself one last time, its teeth finding the farmer's forearm with a force that made him bend. A sound coming out of his throat that Zara recognized. The sound of someone who takes pain and turns it into something harder instead of stepping back. He hit the animal one more time with the hoe. The wolf disappeared into the dark trees. The silence that followed had both weight and temperature. The farmer stood still for 3 seconds with the hoe still raised, staring at the trees where the animal had gone. Then he lowered his arm. He looked at his wounded arm. He looked at Zara. She was on the ground, holding herself up on her right arm, the knife still in her hand, her elbow bleeding onto the rocks, and her ankle sending a steady, dull pain up her leg. Her amber eyes were locked on him with an expression she herself could not fully name. Suspicion, yes, always suspicion, but under it something she had not felt in a very long time. The surprise of being seen as someone worth saving. He said something. She did not catch the first words because her heart was still hitting too loud, but the second sentence came through clearly. "Can you stand?" She tried. The ankle answered with a pain that made her teeth press together. "No," she said. The word came out in common, but with the hard accent of the north, each sound carrying weight like a stone. "My foot." He nodded as if that made perfect sense and walked toward her. He stopped 2 meters away, a distance she recognized as deliberate. Close enough to help, far enough that she did not feel trapped. Then he held out his hand. Zara looked at the hand, looked at him. His arm was bleeding through his shirt sleeve. "You are hurt too," she said. "I know," he replied. "But you are on the ground. First things first." She stared at his outstretched hand, longer than was reasonable. Humans did not help orcs without wanting something back. That was a law as basic as gravity, confirmed in every village she had ever passed through, in every look that turned hard when the right light showed the color of her skin. But the hand stayed there, steady, patient. She took it. There is a strange closeness in letting someone take care of your wound. It is a moment when the body decides to trust before the mind gives permission. The house was exactly 32 steps from the edge of the forest. She counted, because counting was a way of holding on to something when everything else seemed to have shifted away from where it should be. It was small, made of stone and wood darkened by the damp of many winters, with a thatched roof that had been patched in at least 3 different places by hands that knew what they were doing. One window on each side of the door. A small garden on the side with herbs she recognized even from a distance, rosemary, sage, something that might be yarrow growing wild between the border stones. The smell inside was old wood, cook fire smoke and something harder to name. The smell of a house where someone has lived alone long enough that even the silence has picked up a scent. He helped her into the chair closest to the cold fireplace, then went to gather what he needed with the calm efficiency of someone who had dealt with injuries before. She watched him. Watching was her strongest instinct, and noticed how he limped slightly on his right side when he thought she wasn't looking, how his wounded arms stayed stiffer when he needed to reach for something high. "Sit here," he said, bringing a bucket of water, clean cloths, and a small pot of something that smelled of honey and herbs. "I'll look at the elbow first." "I can do it myself," said Zara. "You can," he agreed without any edge, "but it will be harder with the wrong hand. Also, you'll want both hands free if I do something you don't like." She looked at him. There was something in that sentence, the awareness that she might want to react, and the fact that he included that in his thinking, without being afraid of it. That was different from anything a human had said to her before. "What is your name?" she asked. "Edric," he said, beginning to clean the cut on her elbow with a gentleness that was almost annoying in how careful it was. "And yours?" "Zara." He nodded. He did not ask where she came from, or what she was doing in the forest, or why she was alone. He just kept cleaning the wound with that focused attention she had seen before in clan healers, the attention of someone who treats the problem in front of them and not the story around it. "This will sting," he warned, before applying the ointment. It stung. She made no sound. He worked in silence for a while, then said, without looking up from her arm, "The ankle is twisted, not broken. Can you feel your toes?" "Yes." "Good. I'll wrap it. It will hurt for a few days, but it will pass." "You have treated injuries before," she said. It was not a question. "My wife was sick for 2 winters before she died," he replied, in a way that made the information sound like a simple fact, even though she knew it was not. "I learned what I needed to learn." Zara was quiet with that for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry." "It's been 3 years," he said, then lower. "I still don't really know what to do with that, but it's been 3 years." She understood what he meant. There are losses that do not get solved, only carried in different ways, depending on the day. When he finished with the ankle, she said, "Your arm. I'll handle it." "Let me see," she said, and there was something in her voice that was neither a request nor a command, just the statement of an intention. "I know what I'm doing." He looked at her for a moment with those brown eyes that held a tired kind of kindness, the kind that had been tested many times and had refused to disappear. Then he held out his arm. The bite was deep. She examined it with careful fingers, feeling where the tissue had torn, thinking through what she knew. There was an herb growing at the edge of his garden. She had seen it through the window. "Yarrow," she said. "In the garden. Do you have it? It grows back every year on its own. I need a handful, new leaves, not the dark ones." He went to get them without questioning. She was alone in the small house for 3 minutes, listening to the smell of old wood, and lived in silence, and she thought that there was something about this place, something in the patched roof and the herbs growing wild between the stones, that spoke of a man who had stopped planning but had not stopped maintaining. There was a difference between those two things, and she knew the weight of each one very well. When he came back with the herbs, she chewed them briefly to release what was useful inside them. She saw his expression shift slightly, surprise at the method, but not disgust, and pressed the poultice over the bite before wrapping it with firm, even knots. "It will swell anyway," she said. "Wolf bites always do, but this will help. You know a lot about herbs." "I learned what I needed to learn," she said, using his own words back to him. He looked at her. For the first time since they had come inside, something in his eyes shifted. Not into closeness, not yet, but it opened one small degree, like a window that has been unlocked but not yet pushed open. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She was. She had left before dawn without eating. "Yes." "Then stay," he said simply, standing to light the stove. "The soup won't take long." Zara sat in the chair with her wrapped ankle resting on the floor and looked at her own hands in her lap, bright green skin with thin scars across the knuckles, and tried to remember the last time a stranger had said stay without wanting something back. She could not remember, but she stayed. There is a moment when the human body stops pretending and gives in to what it had been hiding. Fever is honest that way. It does not lie about how broken the person is inside. The fever started that same night. Zara had decided to sleep in the barn. She had done that on her own, without asking permission, simply taking the blanket he had left folded on the bench near the door and saying she preferred the barn, which was a convenient lie for a more complicated truth. She was not ready to sleep inside 4 walls with a human she had known for 6 hours, no matter what he had done to deserve her trust. Trust was something she built in layers, like a wall, 1 brick at a time. But she woke in the middle of the night, with her trained ears picking up a wrong sound coming from the house. It was not the wolf. It was something quieter and more worrying, the sound of someone getting up and falling. She reached the house with her ankle complaining at every step and found Edric on the kitchen floor, halfway between the bed and the table, with his forehead resting against the cold wood of the floor as if he had calculated that it was the coolest surface available. His wrapped arm was hot when she touched it, too hot, with that specific heat she had seen before in infected wounds. Dry, deep, the heat of a body fighting something that had entered through the bite. Edric. He opened his eyes. They were too bright. "I'm fine," he said, which was such a clear lie that she almost respected the effort. "You are not," she said. "Get up. You need to be in bed." "I can get up," she said again, firmer, sliding her arm under his. "You helped me when I was on the ground. Now be quiet and let me help." He was quiet. She got him to the bed, with more difficulty than she had expected. He was broad in the shoulders and heavy in the way of men who work with their bodies every day, the weight distributed through muscle and bone rather than fat. And with her ankle still bad, she'd had to use the wall as a lever 3 times. But she managed. Then she looked at the problem. The bite had swelled exactly as she had said it would. The skin around the bandage was red and hot, the edges taking on the color that comes before serious infection. The fever was high, not dangerous yet, but heading there. She could leave. The thought arrived with a cold, clean clarity, not judging her, just presenting itself as an option. She owed him nothing beyond the poultice she had already made. She could take the blanket, go out through the barn, and disappear into the forest before dawn. Nobody would see her go. He would probably not even remember clearly that she had been there. She stood looking at him for a moment. He had fallen asleep or fainted slightly. There was a thin difference between the two with a high fever, and in that unconsciousness there was something that made him easier to read than when he was awake. The square jaw relaxed, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years of sun and grief and lonely work. His hands on top of the blanket, calloused from the palms to the fingertips, with the specific mark of the hoe handle pressed into his right thumb, the hands of someone who had raised a tool toward a wolf without thinking twice. Zara made her decision without any big ceremony inside herself. She went back to the barn, got her bag, and brought back what she had: dried chamomile, burdock root, 2 strips of willow bark she carried for emergencies exactly like this one. She boiled water on the stove. It took her a little while to understand the different mechanism from the clan cook fire, but she figured it out. And made the tea in the proportion that the healer from her childhood had taught her before everything between them had gone wrong. She woke Edric just enough to make him drink. He drank without complaint, which she took as a sign that the fever had already gone past the point where pride works as a filter. Then he lay back down, and she sat in the chair beside the bed and listened to his breathing slowly even out, the fast rhythm of the fever giving way by small degrees to something that looked more like real sleep. Besides the smell of old wood and herbs and the low crackle of the fire she had kept going, the house was quiet in the way only country houses can be. A silence that had texture and weight, That was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something older and calmer than the noise of the day. She did not sleep. She sat and watched. Sometimes he murmured something she could not make out. Once he said a name, Lena, with an unguarded tenderness that made Zara look away for a moment, as if she had seen something that was not hers to witness. In the middle of the night, when the fever was still high but had stopped climbing, he opened his eyes with more clear thinking than she expected and found her there in the chair, her amber eyes catching the low firelight. He lay still for a long moment looking at her. Then he said, "Why didn't you leave?" It was the honest question, without blame and without early gratitude. Just the real question. Zara thought for a moment before answering. "Because you didn't ask what I was before you held out your hand," she said. "Most people ask first." He was quiet with that. Fever makes us either thoughtful or just honest. It is hard to know which. "That makes sense," he said at last, and closed his eyes again. She stayed until morning. There are words that only exist in the half-light between sleep and being awake, when the filters of pride have not yet been turned on by the morning. Those are the most honest words a person says in their whole life. The fever lasted 4 days, not 4 dramatic days in a row. There were moments when he woke up clear-headed enough to eat soup and argue with her about how much honey should go in the tea, and moments when the fever climbed again, and he drifted somewhere between thinking and the place where feverish people go. Zara learned to tell the two states apart by the quality of his breathing. When he was truly awake, it was steady and slightly shorter than normal. When the fever had him, it moved in an uneven rhythm, with strange pauses, as if his body was making decisions about breathing that should have been automatic. She did not leave. On the second day, with the fever a little lower and him able to sit up with the headboard for support, she went to the garden and gathered what was useful. There was more than she had expected, not just the wild yarrow, but lavender, lemon balm, an echinacea plant that had survived the winter, with the stubbornness specific to plants nobody planted on purpose. She made a new poultice for the wound, which had steadied, not getting better quickly, but the worst of the spreading had stopped, and a mixed tea that smelled like open fields and pine and something slightly bitter that made him make a face when he drank it. "The more you complain, the more I put in," she said. "I'm not complaining," he said, clearly complaining. "Your face is. My face is my own." She took that as a sign he was getting better. The conversation started this way, in small pieces, like tools you pick up one at a time from a box that has been closed too long. He asked about the poultice. She explained. He asked where she had learned. She hesitated exactly the right number of seconds for him to notice the hesitation, and then decided that honesty was less expensive than mystery. "In my clan," she said, "with the healer. Before I left, did you leave or were you sent away?" he asked, and the fact that he understood there was a difference between choosing to go and being pushed out showed her that he was paying real attention. She considered the question honestly. "Both," she answered. "I refused to watch 3 men be killed for no reason. That was my choice. What came after was the result." He was quiet with that. "What kind of men?" he asked at last. "Human," she said, and there was a specific weight to that word coming from her now, in this context, in this house. Merchants who had crossed into clan territory without knowing it. Not armed for war. They had goods and an old donkey. And you spoke up. And I spoke up. That was brave. It was not great for my situation, she said, with a dryness that was both a little funny and completely honest. He let out something that was half cough, half laugh, and she felt more pleased by that sound than made any real sense. On the 3rd day, while she was changing his bandage and he was staring at the ceiling with the look of someone reviewing their whole life in silence, he said without any lead-up, "My wife died of fever too." Zara did not stop what she was doing, because stopping would have made the sentence feel too big, and she sensed that he needed it to be treated like a normal-sized sentence. What was her name? Lena. You loved her very much. It was not a question. She had heard the name in the night of the high fever. Yes, he said. She was the reason I had come here, to this land. She wanted a house at the edge of a forest where it was quiet enough to hear the birds in the morning. He paused. It's still quiet enough. There was a specific loss in that sentence. Not just the loss of Lena, but the loss of the reason why the quiet had been something to want. When the person who made a place special is gone, the place remains, but with an empty space that has exactly the shape of what is missing. Zara knew that shape of emptiness. My clan was the only family I had, she said, without him having asked. An offering, maybe. A kind of balance. I was born there. I learned to fight there, to heal, to hunt, to read the Northern Star map. Everything I am was built in that place. And then you questioned, and then I questioned, and lost everything. And lost, she agreed. But I don't regret it. It's hard to carry both things at the same time, the loss and the certainty that I would do it all again. But that's how it is. Edric looked at her with those brown eyes that had gotten sharper now that the fever was pulling back, and said, That's not complicated. It's just the price of having honesty in a world that prefers easy. She looked at him for a moment. You think too much for a farmer, she said. I've had only myself to talk to for 3 years, he replied. You can think a lot in that time. Nobody decides to trust. Trust simply moves into the space that fear stopped guarding. On the 5th day, the fever had passed, and Edric was on his feet. Not completely. There was a post-fever lightness that she recognized, the kind that feels like freedom until you try to carry something or walk too fast and discover that the lightness was emptiness, not strength. But he was up, and he was insisting on being useful, which she had discovered was a central part of who he was. He worked through difficulty by moving, by doing things with his hands. You should rest 1 more day, she said. The chickens don't know that. The chickens are fine. You fed the chickens? Someone had to. He stood in the kitchen doorway looking at her with an expression she was still learning to read. There were many layers in this man's face, built up over the years like coats of paint on an old wall, and she had started to tell apart the ones closest to the surface. That particular expression she had begun to file under gratitude that he does not yet know how to say out loud. Thank you, he said at last. The chickens were annoying, she replied, but alive. Her ankle had gotten better enough that she could put weight on it without the sharp pain of the first days. There was still a deep soreness, but the manageable kind, the kind you learn to fold into your movement instead of fighting against. She helped where she could, carried water from the well with her good arm, mended a broken leather strap on the ox yoke, a job she did with the automatic speed of someone who grew up repairing battle equipment, gathered more herbs to keep up the supply of the preventive tea she had made him drink twice a day. In return, he cooked, and he was, she discovered, surprisingly good at it. You cook like someone who had to learn, she said on the afternoon of the 5th day, watching him work on a stew with the focus of a man solving a moderately hard problem. Lena cooked better, he said, not with sadness, but with the plain tone of someone who had compared 2 things and reached a conclusion. When she got sick, I learned, so she would not have to worry about it. And after she was gone, I kept going. It was a reason to use the stove. She thought about that. The small anchors that keep us alive, not the big reasons for living, but the little habits that make a shape in the emptiness. The chickens, the stove, the garden that grew wild but that he had never pulled out. On the 6th day, he went to the barn and came back with a slightly different look on his face. You fixed the barn roof, he said. There was a gap. That would have taken hours. I was awake. There were spare tiles in the back pile. He stood in the kitchen doorway looking at her with the layered expression, and this time something was closer to the surface than before. Something that she classified with a care that was both self-protection and honesty, as the beginning of something I need to be careful not to name wrong. "Why are you still here?" he asked. It was the second time he had asked that question. The first had been with a high fever. This one was different, not accusing, not desperate, just genuinely curious, with that quality of direct honesty she had recognized as his most constant feature. She thought before answering. "My clan may have moved," she said. "I don't know where, and my ankle is not ready for 2 days of walking." It was true. It was not all of the truth. "And when it is?" he asked. "Then I decide," she said. He nodded as if that was a complete answer, which perhaps it was. That night, for the first time, she slept inside the house, not because he had asked, or because she had asked, but because it had started to rain, with the intention of someone who had no plans to stop before morning. And he had simply said, "The bed in the tool room is hard, but it's clean," without making it into anything more than what it was. She slept with the knife within arm's reach, as always. But she slept. Peace is a fragile thing, not because the world is cruel, but because the world has memory, and the things that attacked you once know where you live. The wolf came back on the 10th night, not alone. Zara woke from instinct before the conscious sound arrived. Something in the feeling of the air had changed, a different pressure against the walls of the house, and she was on her feet with the knife in her hand before she fully understood why. Then she heard it. The low sound of paws moving on the wet ground outside the window. Not the step of one animal, but the step of several animals talking to each other through the organized silence of a hunt. A pack. She went to Edric's room without ceremony and knocked on the door. "Wolves," she said when he opened it, still half asleep. "At least 4, maybe more." He was completely awake within 2 seconds. She watched him process the information and act without the freezing up that many men would have had. He went to the wall where the old shotgun hung, checked the load with his fingers in the dark, grabbed the big knife from the belt hanging on the chair. "How many can you see?" he asked, going to the window. She went to the other window. Her amber eyes saw better in the dark than his, a physical difference she had learned early to use as an advantage. 5, she said after a moment. "The wounded one is in front. The left shoulder is still bad, but it's here anyway." "Anger or hunger?" "Anger," she said. "If it were hunger, it would be at the chicken coop, not here." Edric was quiet for a moment. "Have you fought wolves before?" "Things worse than wolves." "That wasn't a doubt," he said. "It was information, so we can work together." She looked at him. There was something in that, the trust assumed rather than questioned, that she needed a moment to absorb. "Yes," she said, "many times." "Then I take the ones on the right, you take the left. Don't let any of them reach the back door where the tools are. If they get in there, we lose our space to move." "Understood." They went out the front door together. Him with the shotgun and the knife, her with the long knife she had pulled from her bag, and a piece of solid wood she had grabbed from the firewood pile. It was a choice he noticed and approved of with a single small nod. What followed was more noise than it was long. The wolves had gotten used to attacking targets that did not fight back with any strategy. The coordinated position of the two of them, the absence of panic, the immediate counterattack, confused the pack. The wounded wolf, which had certainly led the others back here with the memory of the territory, received a second injury when it tried to go around Zara on the left side and found the piece of wood hitting its nose before it found what it had expected. 3 shots. 2 wolves wounded. The pack retreated into the trees in a more disorganized way than they had arrived. The silence that followed was different from the silence after the first attack. This one had the texture of shared exhaustion and shared relief, not individual shock. Edric was beside her, breathing deeply, his wounded arm that had held the shotgun trembling slightly with the effort. She had a shallow cut on her left forearm where one of the wolves had gotten close enough. He saw the cut before she said anything. "Inside," he said. "It's nothing." "Inside, anyway." She went. While he cleaned the cut with the same careful attention as always, she looked out the window toward the edge of the forest. There was something there. Not wolves, but something different. Human shapes in the distance, standing on the road that passed about 200 meters from the property, watching. "Do you have neighbors?" she asked. Edric looked out the window. The expression on his face changed in a way she had not seen before. Not fear, but a tense waiting, like someone who sees something coming that they expected and had not yet decided how to face. "The village of Heron's Crossing is 1/2 kilometer away," he said. "They must have heard the shots. They came to see what was happening. They came to see," he agreed, with a tone that held more than the words. Zara moved her eyes from the window and looked at him. "When you see them tomorrow," she said carefully but without going around it, "what will you tell them about me?" He looked back at her for a long moment. The firelight threw shadows across the angles of his face. "The truth," he said. "That you are here, that you helped me, and that you are here for as long as you want to be." She looked at him. "That will make things hard for you." "Probably." And still," he confirmed simply, as if the logic did not need any more words than that. Zara looked back out the window. The shapes on the road had gotten fewer, but had not fully disappeared. "My clan is looking for me, too," she said, a thing she'd been putting off saying, without quite admitting to herself that she was putting it off. "If they find out where I am. What do they do to someone who left because they questioned?" "It depends on how much time has passed," she said, "and how good the leader's mood is." Edric nodded with that fact-accepting quality that was one of the most unsettling and most calming things about him. "So we have 2 problems coming," he said. "2 problems coming," she confirmed. "Good," he said, tying off the bandage on her arm with a firm knot. "I'd rather know than not know. Prejudice is not born from hate. It is born from fear that never found a different story to replace the one it already had." Aldrich Marsh came the next morning. He was the oldest of the neighbors and the one who held a kind of authority in the small village of Heron's Crossing. Not official authority, but real authority, the kind that comes from decades of being the most reliable one, the most experienced one, the first person people looked for when there was a problem. He was about 60 years old, with a short white beard and the posture of someone who had worked outside their whole life. He came alone, which Zara read as a sign. A man who comes alone either has a lot of power or is trying to handle something without making it bigger, with Aldrich probably both. Edric met him at the entrance, and Zara stayed visible in the kitchen. She had talked about this briefly with Edric that morning, the difference between hiding, which would look like guilt, and staying visible but not pushing herself into the middle of a conversation that was between them first. She watched them talk. She could not hear well, but she read their bodies with ease. Aldrich, with the held-back posture of someone who has already formed an opinion, but is giving the other person the courtesy of explaining first. Edric, with his shoulders square, and his voice low and steady, without being defensive, but without moving back either. He was telling the story. She could tell by the gestures, the hand going to the wounded arm, then toward the forest, then toward the house. The conversation lasted 15 minutes. When Aldrich came inside, Zara was standing. Her amber eyes met the older man's grey eyes without looking away. If he expected her to look at the floor, he would be waiting a long time. Aldrich looked her up and down with the direct attention of someone who is making an assessment, not starting a fight. There was a difference, and she knew both well. Then he said, in common with a heavy local accent, "You treated his wound. Yes. And you stayed during the fever. Yes. And last night the wolves. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Most orcs who pass through here don't stop, he said. They just pass. I had a twisted ankle, she said. You twisted your ankle on the first day, he said, with the sharp mind of someone who had gotten to 60 by paying attention. You've been here more days than that. She did not answer. Edric looked at Edric, then back at her. There are people in the village who will talk, he said, not as a threat, but as information. You need to know that. I know that, she said. And he knows that, said Edric, with a nod toward Edric. And still, confirmed Edric. The old farmer stood between them for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he said, more to himself than to either of them, well, wolves in winter are everyone's problem. And he left. Edric closed the door and stood with his back to it for a second. When he turned around, there was something in his face that she would have called relief mixed with the awareness that relief was too early. Edric was one man, and there were more. That is the beginning, not the end, she said. I know, he said, but it was better than I expected. 2 days later, a group of 3 younger men from the village appeared at the property. Not hostilely, they stood at the edge of the land without crossing onto the property itself, which was an important detail of country manners that meant they were still on the talking side of things, not the confrontation side. But there was a stiffness in the way they held themselves, the stiffness of people who have come to deliver a position. Edric went to meet them. Zara stayed near the window. The conversation was short. She could not hear the words, but saw the gestures. One of them pointed at the house, then at the forest, then made a motion that could mean, make her go. Edric stood with his arms crossed through the whole conversation, which she knew was body language for closing, not opening. And when the men left, there was a new tension in his shoulders that he carried back into the house. What did they say? She asked. That orcs in the forest are a problem. That an orc in a human's house is a different kind of problem. That I should think about what was good for the village. And you said, that I think about what's good for my property, he said, and that what's good for my property includes the person who saved my life and who last night was the only reason the wolves didn't reach the back door. She was quiet with that. This will get worse before it gets better, she said. Probably. I can leave, she said. It would be simpler for you. He looked at her, and then he said something she did not expect. You have a habit of offering to leave when things get hard. She opened her mouth, closed it, because it was true, and she knew it was true, and the fact that he had noticed it in less than 2 weeks, something she had taken years to admit to herself, left her without the argument she had been preparing. It's easier to go than to be pushed out, she said at last. I know, he said gently, but nobody is pushing you out of here. There are 2 ways of being found, by someone who was looking for you to bring you back, and by someone who was looking for you to make you understand there is no more back to go to. They arrived on the 3rd day after the visit from the village men. There were 5 of them. She saw them come through the north edge of the trees, not by the road that humans used, but through the forest border, where the shadows were thickest even in the morning. She recognized 2. Gorath, who had been her hunting companion in childhood, and who now wore the face marks of the council warriors, and Mira, who had been a healer's apprentice at the same time as her, and who looked at the world with the eyes of someone who measures everything in terms of what it costs. Also among them was Breca, the clan leader's right hand. He was the one Zara had feared most. She went out to meet them before they reached the door, a deliberate choice of ground, her body saying, "This is where I chose to be, not where I am trapped." Edric came with her without needing to be asked, standing beside her with the ease of someone who had always been there. Breca stopped 10 meters away. His dark green eyes moved over Edric with the cold calculation of a warrior measuring an opponent, Zara, he said in the Orc language. The council calls you back. The council has no authority over what I do outside clan territory, she replied in the same language. I learned that from Gorvan before he was replaced. The new council has new rules. The new council, she said, also ordered the death of 3 unarmed traders. I'm not very interested in the new council's opinion on where I should be. Goreth shifted slightly. She noticed. The position was defensive, not aggressive. Yet, you are living with a human, said Breca, and there was in the words the specific sound of a judgment that uses the neutrality of fact as a cover for the poison of accusation. The clan knows. The clan knows many things, she said. The clan also knows that it was me who said no when things needed a no. You shamed? I did not, she said, and there was a thread of iron in her voice that came from 2 winters of carrying that accusation, and finally, in this moment, understanding that she did not need to hold it anymore. I did the only thing that made me worthy of the marks I carry. If the council calls that shame, the problem is the council's, not mine. There was a silence. Edric was beside her and had not understood the words. They had spoken in the Orc language, but he had understood the structure of the conversation with the clarity of someone who reads tension better than vocabulary. When Breca moved 1 step forward, Edric moved too, not in front of her, not trying to protect her in a way that would make her smaller, but beside her, at the same level, his body saying what needed no words in any language, we are 2, not 1. Breca looked at him, then looked at Zara, and for the first time there was something in his eyes that was not certainty. You choose this, he said at last. You understand what you are choosing. I choose, she said, and I understand. Another silence. Longer. Mira, who had been quiet through the whole exchange, then said something low that only Zara could hear clearly. Take care of yourself, Zara. It was not a threat. It was genuine. And from that genuine care came a different kind of pain. The pain of knowing that there were people in the clan who loved her, and that even so the system they lived in left no room for that love to outweigh the rules. They left. Zara stood looking at the space where they had been for a time she did not measure. Then she felt Edric's hand, not grabbing, just resting briefly on her shoulder. The specific gesture of someone asking, "Are you still here?" Without using words. She was. What did they say? He asked. That I made a choice, she said, and that they understood. That's all that matters, she said. But when they turned to go inside, she went to the well first, because she needed a moment alone with the sound of water, and she cried briefly and with some anger, the specific crying of someone who has lost something they had already lost before, but where the final confirmation had its own weight. Then she washed her face and went to help Edric fix the barn latch that had broken during the night of the wolves. In the end, it is not blood that defines what we are. It is what we choose to build when we have the option to build nothing. Winter came 3 weeks later, not the sudden, dramatic winter of a story, but the real winter, which comes first in the leaves and then in the wind. And then one morning when you wake up and the frost has covered everything during the night and the whole world has gone quiet in a way that is different from the quiet before. Zara was in the garden when the first snow fell, very small, almost like mist. The kind of snow you mistake for your own breath until you look up and see that it is coming from somewhere that is not you. Edric came out with 2 coats and handed her one. She took it. They did not say anything for a moment. They stood looking at the small snow falling on the garden and the rocks and the patched roof of the barn. The roof she had fixed on a sleepless night that felt much further away than 3 weeks. We'll need more firewood, she said at last. I cut half already. You helped with the other half. There's a crack in the north wall of the barn that will be a real problem in January. I saw it. I have the mortar. The chickens need a better nest for the cold. Zara. What? You don't need to list tasks to justify staying. She was quiet. There was snow on the tip of her pointed ear. She lifted her hand and removed the small flake with her thumb without thinking much about it. I know I don't, she said at last. Then stay because you want to, he said. Simply. Without drama. Without a big, prepared speech, with the same directness as everything he had ever said to her since the first day. If you want. She looked at him. The amber eyes with their gold reflections met the dark brown eyes with that tired and gentle and determined expression that had been the first thing she had studied in him, back in the forest, when he had held out his hand and she had stared at it for too long. I want, she said, and the world did not stop, and the birds did not sing in any special way, and there was nothing but the small snow continuing to fall on the garden of a widowed farmer and an exiled orc, who were standing in the same yard, wearing coats taken from the same pile. And that was more than enough. In the months that followed, things did not become simple. Simplicity was the luxury of those who had never belonged to two worlds that refused to recognize each other. There were days when the village men passed on the road with looks that were louder than words. There were nights when she woke from a dream about the clan, with the knife already in her hand before she remembered where she was. There were hard conversations about the future, and about what we meant when the two parts of the we carried histories so different that sometimes it felt like two languages being spoken at the same time. But there was also Edric, who started to greet her by name when they crossed on the road, and who once, during a bad storm, sent his youngest son with supplies without anyone having asked. There was Mira, who appeared alone one foggy morning with herbs that Zara could not find in the region, and who said nothing more than they're good in the stew before leaving. There was the moment when Gareth, crossing the property with a hunting group, stopped briefly, looked at both of them and nodded, a minimal nod but a real one. The world does not change all at once. It changes in millimeters, in the language of nods and names said out loud, and supplies sent during storms. And there were the small things that needed no world at all to exist. The cup of tea left on the table before dawn for when she woke up, at exactly the right temperature, because he had learned precisely how long it took to cool. The hoe put back against the wall in the right spot after she used it, because he knew she hated things out of place, even though she had never said so in words. The way she had begun, without noticing exactly when, to sleep without the knife within reach. One evening in January, with the snow outside making that specific quiet that only exists when the world is covered in white. They were sitting at the table after supper. She was cleaning the long knife, and he was mending one of the leather straps from the ox yoke, when he said, "You know, I had stopped expecting this." "Expecting what?" she asked, without looking up from the knife. "Anything," he said. "For the last 3 years, I had stopped expecting anything. I just stayed, took care of the chickens and the garden and the roof, but I didn't expect." She stopped cleaning the knife. "And now?" she asked. He looked up from the leather and looked at her, and in those brown eyes that had seen grief and work and 3 winters of silence, there was something new, not the absence of the old pain, but something that had begun to take up space beside it. "Now I expect," he said. "The morning, the tea, you arguing with the chickens." "I do not argue with the chickens." "You absolutely argue with the chickens." She looked at him for a moment with that amber intensity that she had learned to use to hide everything and had slowly started to use to show things instead. "Edric. Zara." "Thank you," she said, for moving forward. He did not need to ask what for the forest, for the outstretched hand, for the truth told to Edric, for the shoulder on the night of the 5 wolves, for the coat passed in the first snow, for every act of service and every refusal to step back that had built brick by brick the thing they were now. "Thank you for not leaving," he said. Outside, The snow continued falling on the small property at the edge of the Ashenvale forest, covering the garden and the patched barn and the well and the ground where wolves had retreated, and where a clan had found a woman who did not go back with them. And the silence was the good kind, not the silence of a house where someone has lived alone too long, but the silence of a place where two kinds of quiet had learned to breathe at the same rhythm. Blood makes you orc, pain makes you human, but choosing to build is what makes you family.